Let us begin our journey tonight in a place that might seem, at first, quite distant from the word nihilism itself. To understand what nihilism means and why a German philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche would declare that God is dead, we must first understand what came before. We must understand the world that nihilism emerged from, like a shadow emerging from beneath a heavy stone. Imagine, if you will, Europe in the centuries before the 1800s. Picture cobblestone streets, candlelit churches, and a world where nearly everyone you might meet, Christian, or at least surrounded by Christian culture. The church bells rang out the hours. The calendar itself was organized around saints' days and holy festivals. And most importantly, the stories people told about why things happened, about what was good and what was evil, about what life meant. All of these stories came from a single source. They came from God. This was not merely a matter of Sunday worship. The entire architecture of meaning in European life, the framework that held up every question of why and how should I live, rested on a foundation of religious belief. If you asked a farmer in 1600 why he should be honest, he might tell you that God commands it. If you asked a merchant why suffering exists, she might say it is God's test, or God's punishment, or part of God's mysterious plan. Every answer, in some way, pointed back to the divine. Now, this does not mean that everyone was perfectly devout, or that there were no skeptics. Human beings have always questioned. But the shared language of meaning, the common vocabulary that people used to make sense of their lives, was religious. It was theistic. It assumed that there was a purpose woven into the fabric of existence itself. And that purpose came from God. Let us paint this picture more vividly. In the medieval period, which stretched from roughly the 5th century to the 15th century, European thought was dominated by what we call scholasticism. This was a method of learning that sought to reconcile Christian theology with the philosophy of ancient thinkers, particularly Aristotle. The greatest of the scholastic thinkers was a man named Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 13th century. Aquinas, working in candlelit monasteries and early universities, constructed elaborate logical arguments for the existence of God. He proposed what he called the 5 ways, 5 separate logical paths that, he believed, all led inevitably to the conclusion that God must exist. One of these arguments suggested that, because we see motion in the world, there must be a first mover, an original cause of all motion, and that mover is God. Another argued that, because we see purpose and design in nature, a bird's wing designed for flight, a flower designed to attract bees, there must be a divine designer. These were not merely academic exercises. They were attempts to show that faith and reason pointed in the same direction, that the universe was not chaotic or random, but ordered and meaningful, because it was created and sustained by a rational, purposeful God. This worldview is sometimes called theistic rationalism, and, slowly and clearly, it provided a sense of cosmic security. You were not alone. Your life was not meaningless. You were part of a grand plan. But, gently, as the centuries turned, something began to shift. Seeds of change were planted, often by people who had no intention of undermining religious belief. Let us consider the Renaissance, that great flowering of art and learning that began in Italy in the 14th century and spread across Europe. Renaissance thinkers looked back to the classical world, to ancient Greece and Rome, and they rediscovered texts and ideas that had been forgotten or suppressed. They read Plato and Aristotle in new translations. They studied geometry and astronomy. They painted the human body with unprecedented realism, celebrating the beauty of the physical world. And while many Renaissance figures were deeply religious, their focus had shifted ever so slightly. They celebrated human potential, human reason, human creativity. This movement came to be called humanism, and it suggested that human beings themselves were capable of greatness, not merely as servants of God, but as thinkers and creators in their own right. Then came the scientific revolution. In the 16th and 17th centuries, figures like Nicolaus Copernicus, Galileo Galilei, Johannes Kepler, and Isaac Newton began to describe the natural world in a new language, not the language of divine purpose, but the language of mathematics and mechanical law. Copernicus demonstrated that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but merely one planet among several, orbiting the Sun. Galileo turned his telescope to the heavens and saw mountains on the Moon, spots on the Sun, imperfections in what was supposed to be the perfect, unchanging celestial realm. Newton, perhaps most profoundly, showed that the same laws that governed a falling apple also governed the motion of the planets. The heavens and the earth operated according to the same principles. The universe began to look less like a kingdom ruled by a divine monarch, and more like a vast machine, operating according to consistent, discoverable laws. Now, it is important to note that most of these early scientists were themselves religious. Newton spent as much time studying biblical prophecy as he did studying physics. They saw their work as uncovering the laws that God had written into nature. But, calm, measured tone, the implications of their discoveries would take time to unfold. If the universe operates according to natural laws, do we need God to explain why things happen? If human reason can discover these laws, is divine revelation truly necessary? Slowly and clearly. In the 18th century, a period we call the Enlightenment, these questions became more explicit. Enlightenment thinkers championed reason, science, and individual liberty. They criticized superstition and dogma. Some, like Voltaire in France, remained theists. They believed in God, but often in a distant, impersonal God who created the universe and then stepped back, allowing it to run according to natural laws. This view is called deism. Others went further. The French philosopher Denis Diderot, for example, moved from Catholicism to deism to atheism over the course of his life. He suggested that matter itself, governed by natural laws, could account for the complexity and diversity of life. No divine creator required. The Scottish philosopher David Hume questioned whether we could ever truly prove that God exists, or that miracles occur. He argued that our belief in cause and effect is merely a habit of mind, not a logical certainty. Pausing for a moment, and yet, even as these ideas circulated among educated elites, the broader culture remained deeply religious. The vast majority of people in Europe and America still attended church, still baptized their children, still believed in heaven and hell. The Enlightenment had raised questions, but, with a soft whisper, it had not yet shattered the framework of meaning. That shattering, that great fracture, would come in the 19th century. As if thinking aloud, the 19th century brought industrialization, which uprooted millions from rural villages and traditional ways of life, moving them into crowded, anonymous cities. It brought political revolutions, which challenged the divine right of kings and the authority of the church. And it brought new scientific theories that seemed to strike at the very heart of religious cosmology, slowly and clearly. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, which proposed that the diversity of life on Earth could be explained not by divine design, but by natural selection, a blind, purposeless process in which organisms better adapted to their environment were more likely to survive and reproduce. Human beings, Darwin would later suggest, were not specially created in God's image, but had evolved from earlier primate ancestors. We were part of nature, subject to the same laws as every other living thing. This was, for many, deeply disturbing. If there was no special creation, no divine plan, what made human life sacred? What made it meaningful? The poet Alfred Tennyson, writing before Darwin, but grappling with similar ideas from geology and paleontology, described nature as red in tooth and claw, a realm of violence and death, not divine benevolence. At the same time, scholars were applying new methods of historical and textual criticism to the Bible itself. German scholars in particular began to analyze the biblical texts as historical documents written by human authors in specific cultural contexts, reflecting the beliefs and biases of their time. This approach, sometimes called higher criticism, suggested that the Bible was not the timeless, inerrant Word of God, but a collection of human writings, full of contradictions and historical inaccuracies. With a calm, measured tone, one of the most controversial figures in this movement was David Friedrich Strauss, who published The Life of Jesus, Critically Examined, in 1835. Strauss argued that many of the miracle stories in the Gospels were not historical facts, but myths, symbolic narratives created by early Christian communities to express their faith. This was shocking. If the miracles were myths, if the resurrection itself might be a metaphorical story rather than a literal event, what remained of Christianity? All of these currents, the rise of science, the critique of religious texts, the social upheavals of industrialization and revolution, came together in the 19th century, like streams flowing into a single river. And that river was carrying European culture away from the old certainties, away from the world where God's existence and God's plan could be taken for granted. But here is the crucial point, the point we must understand before we can grasp what Nietzsche meant when he said, God is dead. For most people, the loss of these certainties was not liberating. It was terrifying. Imagine that you have lived your entire life in a house. The house has walls and a roof. It keeps you warm and dry. You know every room, every creaking floorboard. And then, one day, you discover that the foundation is crumbling. The walls are beginning to crack. The roof is sagging. You realize that the house might collapse. That was the psychological and spiritual situation of many 19th century Europeans. The old religious framework, which had provided meaning, morality, purpose, comfort, was crumbling, and the question that haunted them was, what comes next? If God is gone, if there is no divine plan, no cosmic purpose, no ultimate justice, then what is the point of anything? What should we believe? How should we live? This anxiety, this vertigo of meaninglessness, had a name. It was called nihilism, and it would be confronted, analyzed, and transformed by a man who was himself deeply troubled, deeply brilliant, and deeply alone. A professor of classical philology who would become a wandering philosopher, a man who would write some of the most disturbing and exhilarating ideas in Western thought. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche, with a calm, measured tone. But before we turn to Nietzsche himself, let us make sure we understand what the word nihilism actually means. The term comes from the Latin word nihil, which means nothing. Nihilism, in its most basic sense, is the belief that life has no inherent meaning, purpose, or value. It is the view that there are no objective moral truths, no cosmic plan, no ultimate significance to human existence. Slowly and clearly, there are different forms of nihilism. Metaphysical nihilism is the view that nothing truly exists, or that reality itself is an illusion. Epistemological nihilism is the view that knowledge is impossible, that we cannot truly know anything. But the form of nihilism that concerned Nietzsche most deeply was what we might call existential nihilism, or moral nihilism, the sense that life is meaningless and that all values are baseless. Gently. In Russia, in the mid-19th century, the term nihilism was used to describe a radical movement of young intellectuals who rejected traditional social and religious values. They believed that the old order was corrupt and needed to be swept away. Ivan Turgenev depicted such a character in his novel Fathers and Sons, published in 1862. The protagonist, Bazarov, declares that he believes in nothing: no art, no beauty, no romance, only science and reason. Pausing for a moment. But the nihilism that Nietzsche would diagnose was not a radical political movement. It was something deeper, more pervasive, and more dangerous. It was the creeping sense, spreading through European culture that, with a soft whisper, because the old religious meanings had collapsed, there might be no meaning at all. That we might be living in a universe that is cold, indifferent, and empty of purpose. And that realization, Nietzsche believed, could lead to despair, paralysis, or destruction. As if thinking aloud, Nietzsche saw nihilism not as a philosophy to be adopted, but as a crisis to be confronted. He believed that European culture was in the process of realizing that God is dead, that the old religious framework could no longer be believed, and he wanted to understand what that realization would do to us. Would it destroy us? Or could we somehow pass through nihilism and emerge on the other side, creating new meanings, new values, new reasons to live? Slowly and clearly, these were the questions that would drive his work. Questions about meaning and meaninglessness, truth and illusion, strength and weakness, creation and destruction. And to understand his answers, gently, we must turn now to the man himself, to his life, his struggles, and the strange, brilliant, difficult books he left behind. Pausing for a moment, but as we prepare to meet Nietzsche, let us hold in our minds this image of the landscape we have just surveyed. A world emerging from centuries of religious certainty. A world being transformed by science, by industry, by new ideas about human origins and human nature. A world in which, with a calm, measured tone, the old answers no longer worked, and the new answers had not yet been found. A world, in short, on the edge of nihilism, with a soft whisper, and in that world, alone and ill, walking the mountains of Switzerland, a philosopher was thinking thoughts that would echo through the next century and beyond. Let us turn now to his story. The life and mind of Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the small town of Rocken, in the Prussian province of Saxony. It is a detail worth noting, though it might seem ironic, that he was born into a deeply religious family. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor. His paternal grandfather was also a pastor, and his mother, Franziska, was the daughter of a Lutheran pastor. The young Friedrich grew up surrounded by the rhythms of Protestant Christianity, hymns, prayers, Bible readings, the quiet solemnity of Sunday services. He was, by all accounts, a serious and pious child. His schoolmates called him the Little Pastor because of his grave demeanor and his habit of reciting Bible verses from memory. But tragedy entered his life early. When Friedrich was not yet 5 years old, his father fell ill. The exact nature of the illness is unclear. Some historians believe it was a brain tumor. Others suggest it might have been a stroke or a neurological disorder. What is certain is that Karl Ludwig suffered, deteriorated, and died in 1849. The following year, Friedrich's younger brother, Joseph, also died. He was only 2 years old. The deaths of his father and brother left a profound mark on the young Nietzsche. He was raised, from that point forward, in a household of women. His mother, his younger sister Elizabeth, his paternal grandmother, and 2 maiden aunts. It was a somber, quiet, deeply religious environment. And yet, as if thinking aloud, we might wonder whether those early losses planted a seed of doubt, whether the suffering he witnessed made him question the benevolence of God's plan. Nietzsche proved to be a brilliant student. At the age of 14, he was awarded a scholarship to Schulpforta, one of Germany's most prestigious preparatory schools. There, he studied classical languages, Latin and Greek, and immersed himself in the literature and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. He read Homer and Plato, Aeschylus and Sophocles, and he discovered a world that existed long before Christianity, a world with its own values and its own sense of greatness. The ancient Greeks, Nietzsche would come to believe, had possessed a vitality, a creative power, a willingness to embrace life in all its beauty and terror that Christianity had suppressed. This idea would become central to his philosophy. But it was still forming, still nascent, as the young scholar moved on to university. In 1864, Nietzsche enrolled at the University of Bonn to study theology and classical philology. But his time at Bonn was turbulent. He struggled with the theological curriculum, finding himself increasingly unable to accept Christian doctrine. He later wrote that he had lost his faith during this period, not through a sudden crisis, but through a gradual erosion, a slow realization that the beliefs he had been taught no longer made sense to him. He transferred to the University of Leipzig in 1865, abandoning theology and focusing entirely on classical philology, the study of ancient texts and languages. At Leipzig, he excelled. His professors were astonished by his talent. One of them, Friedrich Nietzsche, became his mentor and champion. It was also at Leipzig that Nietzsche encountered the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. He discovered Schopenhauer's magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, in a second-hand bookshop, and it struck him like a thunderbolt. Schopenhauer was a pessimistic philosopher who argued that the fundamental reality of the universe is a blind, irrational force he called the will, a ceaseless striving, a hunger that can never be satisfied. Life, Schopenhauer believed, is suffering. Desire is suffering, and the only escape from suffering is to deny the will, to renounce desire, to withdraw from life. This was a bleak vision, and yet Nietzsche found it compelling. It seemed to him more honest, more truthful than the comforting lies of religion. Schopenhauer did not promise that life had a purpose, or that suffering was part of a divine plan. He simply described the world as he saw it, as a place of pain, struggle, and ultimately meaninglessness. Nietzsche would later reject Schopenhauer's pessimism, but in his youth, it shaped him profoundly. It gave him a vocabulary for thinking about suffering and existence, and it reinforced his growing sense that the traditional Christian answers were inadequate. In 1869, something extraordinary happened. Nietzsche, though he had not yet completed his doctoral dissertation, was offered a position as professor of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He was only 24 years old. It was an unprecedented honor, a testament to his brilliance. The University of Leipzig promptly awarded him a doctorate without requiring a dissertation or an examination. And so, the young Nietzsche took up his post in Basel. It was in Basel that Nietzsche formed one of the most important relationships of his life. He became close friends with the composer Richard Wagner, who was living nearby in Tribschen. Wagner was already famous, towering figure in the world of music and culture. And Nietzsche, with a calm, measured tone, who loved music deeply and played the piano himself, idolized Wagner. He visited Wagner frequently, spending long hours in conversation with the composer and his wife, Cosima. Nietzsche saw in Wagner's operas, particularly in The Ring of the Nibelung, an attempt to revive the spirit of ancient Greek tragedy, to create a new mythology for modern Europe. He believed that Wagner's music could redeem culture, could provide the meaning and vitality that Christianity had once offered, but could no longer provide. But this friendship would not last. Over time, Nietzsche became disillusioned with Wagner. He saw in Wagner's later work, particularly in the opera Parsifal, a return to Christian themes and Christian values, a betrayal, as Nietzsche saw it, of the life-affirming vision he had once championed. The two men grew apart, and eventually their friendship ended in bitterness. Nietzsche's time as a professor was difficult. He was a brilliant scholar, but not a particularly effective teacher. His lectures were sparsely attended. He was painfully shy and awkward in social situations. And, most significantly, his health began to deteriorate. He suffered from severe migraines, digestive problems, and eye trouble. The migraines were especially debilitating, blinding, nauseating headaches that could last for days. The cause of Nietzsche's health problems has been debated by scholars and doctors for more than a century. Some have suggested that he suffered from a brain tumor or from a neurological condition similar to the one that killed his father. Others have speculated that he contracted syphilis during a brief visit to a brothel as a young man, and that the disease slowly destroyed his brain. Still others believe his symptoms were psychosomatic, the result of extreme stress and psychological conflict. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Nietzsche's health made it increasingly difficult for him to fulfill his duties as a professor. In 1879, after only 10 years at Basel, he resigned his position on the grounds of ill health. He was granted a modest pension, and he left academic life behind. What followed were what Nietzsche himself called his wandering years. For the next decade, from 1879 to 1889, he lived a solitary, nomadic existence. He moved from place to place, to the Swiss Alps, to the Italian Riviera, to the south of France, always searching for a climate that might ease his suffering. He stayed in cheap boarding houses and hotels. He ate simple meals, often alone. He took long walks in the mountains. And he wrote. In those 10 years of wandering, in those 10 years of pain and solitude, Nietzsche produced the works that would make him one of the most influential and controversial philosophers in history. He wrote Human, All Too Human, Daybreak, The Gay Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morals, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, and more. These books were unlike anything that had been written in philosophy before. They were not systematic treatises. They did not proceed step by step through logical arguments. Instead, with a soft whisper, they were collections of aphorisms, short bursts of insight, poetry and polemic mixed together. They were written in a style that was urgent, vivid, sometimes ecstatic, sometimes furious, as if thinking aloud. Nietzsche wrote as if he were trying to wake people up, to shake them out of their complacency and their comfortable illusions. He wrote as if he were diagnosing a disease, the disease of nihilism, the disease of decadence, the disease of a culture that had lost its way. And he wrote as if he were prescribing a cure, though the cure he prescribed was not gentle or easy, slowly and clearly. But here is the tragic irony. Despite the brilliance of his work, Nietzsche was almost completely unknown during his productive years. His books sold poorly. He received little recognition. He was isolated, both geographically and intellectually. He sent copies of his books to friends and acquaintances, hoping for a response, and often received only silence. He wrote letters describing his ideas, his visions, his sense of mission, and few people understood what he was trying to say. In one letter, written in 1888, he described himself as dynamite, suggesting that his ideas would one day explode into European consciousness. But in his own lifetime, he remained obscure. It is a loneliness that is almost unbearable to contemplate. With a soft whisper, to see so clearly, to think so deeply, to feel so intensely, and to find almost no one who understands. And then, in January of 1889, something broke. Nietzsche was living in Turin, Italy. One day, while walking in the Piazza Carlo Alberto, he saw a horse being whipped by its driver. What happened next has become one of the most famous anecdotes in the history of philosophy. Nietzsche, overcome with emotion, rushed to the horse, threw his arms around its neck, and collapsed. He was carried back to his lodgings. Over the following days, his landlord received a series of bizarre, incoherent letters from him. He signed some of them Dionysus, and others the Crucified. He wrote to friends declaring himself a god, claiming to have ordered the German Kaiser to come to Rome. With a calm, measured tone, it was clear that something terrible had happened. His mind had broken. His friend Franz Overbeck travelled to Turin and brought Nietzsche back to Basel, where he was placed in a psychiatric clinic. The diagnosis was unclear. Some doctors said it was tertiary syphilis. Others suggested a form of psychosis or dementia. But whatever the medical term, with a soft whisper, the result was the same. Friedrich Nietzsche, the brilliant, tormented philosopher, was gone. What remained was a shell. He lived for 11 more years, from 1889 to 1900, but he never recovered. He could not read, could not write, could not engage in coherent conversation. He was cared for, first by his mother, and after her death in 1897, by his sister Elizabeth. He spent his days in a quiet room, sometimes playing the piano, sometimes sitting in silence. He died on August 25, 1900, from pneumonia and a stroke. He was 55 years old. It is one of the saddest stories in intellectual history. A man who thought more deeply about the problem of meaning than almost anyone else, who struggled to find a way to affirm life in the face of nihilism, ended his life in madness and silence. But the ideas he left behind, the books he wrote in those lonely, wandering years, those would survive. They would be read, misread, debated and transformed. They would shape the 20th century in ways Nietzsche himself could never have imagined. But we must be careful. Nietzsche's ideas were often twisted and distorted, especially by his sister Elizabeth. She was a fervent German nationalist and an anti-Semite. And after Nietzsche's collapse, she took control of his literary estate. She edited his unpublished notes and letters, sometimes altering them to make them conform to her own political views. She presented Nietzsche as a prophet of German superiority and militarism. This was a grotesque betrayal. Nietzsche himself had despised German nationalism. He had despised anti-Semitism. He considered himself a good European, not a narrow patriot. But because of Elizabeth's manipulations, Nietzsche's ideas were later appropriated by the Nazis. They claimed him as a forerunner of their ideology, though in truth, he would have been horrified by what they did in his name. This is one of the great tragedies of intellectual history. A philosopher who wrote about the dangers of herd mentality, about the importance of individual greatness, about the need to question all received values, was turned into a mascot for the most brutal form of collective madness. It has taken decades of careful scholarship to recover the real Nietzsche, to separate his actual ideas from the distortions. So who was the real Nietzsche? What did he actually believe? What did he mean when he said, "God is dead"? These are the questions we must now explore. And to do so, we must turn to his most famous and most misunderstood proclamation. The declaration that echoes through all his work. The statement that captures both the crisis of his age and his response to it. With a calm, measured tone, we must turn to the death of God. God is dead, the diagnosis of nihilism. The phrase "God is dead" appears in several of Nietzsche's works, but it is expressed most powerfully in a section of The Gay Science, published in 1882. The passage is titled "The Madman," and it takes the form of a parable, a short, dramatic story that illustrates a philosophical point. Let us imagine the scene as Nietzsche describes it. A madman runs into a marketplace in the bright morning, carrying a lantern. He is searching, he cries out, for God. The people in the marketplace, many of whom do not believe in God, laugh at him. Has God gotten lost? They mock. Did he lose his way like a child? Is he hiding? The madman stares at them and then delivers his shocking message. God is dead, he says. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves? The murderers of all murderers. The madman goes on, his words tumbling out in a kind of ecstatic horror. He asks, "What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun? Where is it moving now? Where are we moving? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing?" And then he asks the most haunting question of all. What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods, simply to appear worthy of it? The people in the marketplace stare at him in silence. They do not understand. And the madman, realizing this, says quietly, "I have come too early. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men." This is one of the most extraordinary passages in all of Nietzsche's writing, and it is essential that we understand what he is actually saying. Because God is dead is not a simple statement of atheism. Nietzsche is not merely saying that he personally does not believe in God. He is making a diagnosis of European culture. He is describing something that has already happened, or is in the process of happening, whether people realize it or not. What does it mean to say that God is dead? It means that the Christian God, the source of all meaning and value in European civilization for more than 1,000 years, is no longer believable. It means that the framework of religious belief, which once held everything together, has collapsed. And most importantly, it means that this collapse is not just an intellectual matter, not just a question of whether certain theological arguments are valid. It is a cultural and psychological earthquake. Nietzsche is saying that we have lost the center of our moral and existential universe. We have lost the foundation upon which all our values were built. And this loss, with a calm, measured tone, is not something we can simply shrug off. It will have profound consequences, consequences we have not yet begun to grasp. With a soft whisper, notice that the madman says, "We have killed him, not God died on his own, but we killed him." This is crucial. Nietzsche is suggesting that the death of God is something that we, human beings, have brought about. How? Through the development of science, through the critique of religious texts, through the spread of Enlightenment rationality, through all the processes of modernization that we described in the first section. We created a world in which belief in God became increasingly difficult. We undermined our own foundation, and the people in the marketplace who laugh at the madman represent those who think that the death of God is no big deal. They are the shallow atheists, the ones who say, "Oh, we don't believe in God anymore, but so what? We can just go on as before, with our science and our progress and our comfortable lives." But Nadman knows better. He knows that the death of God is not a trivial event. It is, he says, a deed too great for us. It demands that we reinvent everything, our values, our meanings, our very sense of who we are. And if we fail to do this, if we simply drift on in the infinite nothing, we will fall into nihilism, as if thinking aloud. This is the heart of Nietzsche's diagnosis. He believed that European culture was in the grip of nihilism, or was about to be, and he believed that most people did not yet realize it. They were still living on borrowed time, still clinging to Christian values like compassion, equality, and the sanctity of human life, even though they no longer believed in the Christian God who supposedly justified those values. With a calm, measured tone, Nietzsche called this a kind of cultural inertia. The old values persist, like the light from a dead star that continues to travel through space, long after the star itself has been extinguished. But eventually, the light will fade. Eventually, people will realize that if there is no God, then there is no cosmic basis for morality, no ultimate justice, no inherent meaning. And when that realization sinks in, what will happen? Nietzsche saw several possibilities, and none of them were comforting. He called these the stages or forms of nihilism. The first is what we might call passive nihilism, or nihilistic despair. This is the sense that, because nothing has meaning, nothing matters. Why strive? Why create? Why love? If all our efforts will ultimately be forgotten, if the universe does not care, if there is no reward in heaven and no punishment in hell, why bother with anything? Nietzsche saw this form of nihilism as a kind of spiritual exhaustion. It is the weariness of the person who says, "What's the point?" and then retreats into apathy or escapism. It is the opposite of vitality, the opposite of life affirmation. And Nietzsche believed that this form of nihilism was spreading, quietly and insidiously, through modern Europe. He saw it in the rise of pessimistic philosophies like Schopenhauer's, which taught that life is suffering and that the best response is to withdraw from life. He saw it in the spread of decadence in art and culture, a kind of tired sophistication that no longer believed in anything but still wanted to be entertained. He saw it in the increasing focus on comfort and pleasure, the sense that because life has no higher purpose, we might as well just seek the easiest, most pleasant existence possible. But passive nihilism was not the only danger. Nietzsche also warned of what we might call active nihilism, or nihilistic destruction. This is the form of nihilism that says, if nothing has value, then I am free to destroy. If there are no moral truths, then I can do whatever I want. If God is dead, then everything is permitted. This is the nihilism of violence and chaos. It is the belief that because the old values have collapsed, we should smash everything and start over. Nietzsche saw glimmers of this in the revolutionary movements of the 19th century, in the anarchists and radicals who wanted to burn down the existing order. And he feared that as the death of God became more widely understood, this active nihilism would grow. In fact, he predicted that the 20th century would be a century of catastrophic wars and upheavals, precisely because the old religious and moral certainties had dissolved. He wrote that Europe would experience a nihilistic rebound, a violent convulsion as the death of God finally made itself felt in politics and culture. And of course, he was right. The 20th century witnessed 2 world wars, totalitarian regimes, genocides, and ideological conflicts of a scale never before seen. Whether these horrors can be directly attributed to the death of God is a matter of debate. But Nietzsche's warning was prescient. When the old sources of meaning collapse, people become desperate for new sources, and that desperation can lead to terrible things. But here is the crucial point, the point that is often missed when people discuss Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead. Nietzsche himself was not a passive nihilist, and he was not an active nihilist. He did not despair, and he did not call for destruction. He saw nihilism as a crisis, yes, but also as an opportunity, with a soft whisper. He believed that the death of God, as terrible as it was, could also be liberating. It could free us from the illusions and false comforts of religion. It could force us to take responsibility for creating our own meanings and values, pausing for a moment. It could, if we were strong enough and brave enough, lead to a new kind of human being. A human being who could affirm life without needing the crutch of divine promises, slowly and clearly. Nietzsche called this the revaluation of all values. He believed that because the old values, the Christian values, were based on a lie, the lie that God exists and has a plan for us, we needed to create new values. Values that were honest, that acknowledged the harsh realities of existence, but that still said yes to life. And this brings us to one of the most important and most difficult aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy, his critique of Christian morality. Pausing for a moment, because for Nietzsche, the death of God was not just about theology. It was about morality. It was about the way we judge good and evil, right and wrong. And he believed that Christian morality itself was a form of nihilism, a hidden, insidious nihilism that had to be overcome, as if thinking aloud. This idea is so strange, so counterintuitive, that we must take our time with it. How can morality be a form of nihilism? Doesn't nihilism mean the absence of morality? Slowly and clearly. To understand Nietzsche's argument, we must look at his most sustained critique of Christian values, which he developed in a book called On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887. In this book, Nietzsche traces the historical origins of what he calls slave morality, the moral system that values compassion, humility, meekness, and self-denial. He contrasts this with what he calls master morality, the moral system of the ancient aristocrats, which valued strength, pride, nobility, and power. Pausing for a moment. Nietzsche argues that master morality is the original, natural form of human values, the strong and noble, the warriors and rulers, called themselves good, and called their qualities courage, vitality, assertiveness, good. They looked down on the weak and the lowly, calling them bad, but with a soft whisper, not in a moral sense. Bad simply meant inferior, common, not like us, slowly and clearly. But then, Nietzsche argues, something happened. The weak and the oppressed, unable to overcome the strong through force, developed a new moral system. They declared that the qualities of the strong, pride, power, assertiveness, were evil, and they declared that their own qualities, humility, meekness, suffering, were good, as if thinking aloud. This, Nietzsche claims, is the origin of Christian morality. It is a morality born of resentment, a way for the weak to take revenge on the strong by redefining good and evil. Christianity teaches that the meek shall inherit the earth, that the poor are blessed, that suffering is noble, that pride is a sin. All of these teachings, Nietzsche argues, are designed to make the strong feel guilty and to elevate the weak. Now, we must be very careful here. Nietzsche is not saying that we should go back to master morality, that we should embrace cruelty and oppression. He is not advocating for a society ruled by bullies and tyrants. What he is saying is more subtle and more challenging. He is saying that Christian morality, for all its talk of love and compassion, is actually life-denying. It values suffering over joy, self-denial over self-expression, the afterlife over this life. It teaches us to be suspicious of our natural instincts, to feel guilty about our desires, to see the body and the world as corrupt, and in doing so, it drains life of its vitality. This, Nietzsche argues, is the hidden nihilism of Christianity. It says that this life, this world, does not really matter. What matters is the next world, the world of God and heaven. But if God is dead, if there is no next world, then Christian morality has been teaching us to despise the only life we actually have. It has been teaching us to deny life itself. And so, Nietzsche concludes, the death of God does not just mean the collapse of theology, it means the collapse of Christian morality. It means we can no longer ground our values in divine commandments or promises of eternal reward. We must create new values, values that affirm life, that celebrate strength and creativity and growth, rather than weakness and suffering and self-denial. But how do we do this? How do we create new values in a world where God is dead? This is the question that haunted Nietzsche, the question he wrestled with in all his mature work. And his answer, such as it was, took the form of a strange and beautiful vision, a vision of a new kind of human being, a vision of the Übermensch and the eternal return. The concept of the Übermensch, sometimes translated as Overman or Superman, is one of the most famous and most misunderstood ideas in Nietzsche's philosophy. It appears most prominently in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book written between 1883 and 1885, which Nietzsche considered his masterpiece. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is unlike any other work of philosophy. It is written in a poetic, prophetic style, full of metaphors and parables. The protagonist is Zarathustra, a wandering sage who descends from the mountains to teach humanity a new way of thinking. The name Zarathustra is taken from the ancient Persian prophet Zoroaster, who founded one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions. But Nietzsche's Zarathustra is not a religious prophet. He is a prophet of the death of God and the possibility of a new human greatness. The book begins with Zarathustra's descent from his mountain solitude. He has spent 10 years alone, meditating and growing in wisdom. Now, he feels compelled to share what he has learned. In the first speech he gives, in the marketplace of a town, he announces, "I teach you the Übermensch. Man is something that shall be overcome." What does this mean? What is the Übermensch? And why must humanity be overcome? The Übermensch, in Nietzsche's vision, is not a biological evolution, not a different species. It is a psychological and spiritual transformation. It is a new way of being human, a way that moves beyond the limitations and illusions that have defined humanity up to now. Nietzsche believed that most human beings, throughout history, have lived in a state of psychological and spiritual weakness. They have looked outside themselves for meaning and value. They have relied on gods, on traditions, on the herd, on authority figures to tell them what is true and what is good. They have not dared to create their own values or to take responsibility for their own lives. The Übermensch, by contrast, is a human being who has overcome this need for external validation. The Übermensch creates his own values. He does not wait for God to tell him what is good. He decides for himself. He does not seek meaning in an afterlife or in service to a higher power. He creates meaning in this life, through his own actions and his own creative will. The Übermensch is life-affirming. He says yes to existence, even with all its pain and uncertainty. He does not flee from suffering or seek to escape into comforting illusions. He embraces the totality of life, the joy and the sorrow, the creation and the destruction. And he finds in that embrace a kind of greatness. Now, it is crucial to understand what Nietzsche is not saying. He is not saying that the Übermensch is a tyrant who tramples on others. He is not saying that the Übermensch is free to do whatever he wants without regard for others. The Übermensch is not defined by power over others, but by power over himself, by self-mastery, self-creation, and self-overcoming. In one of the most important passages in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes 3 stages of spiritual transformation. He calls them the 3 metamorphoses of the spirit. First, the spirit becomes a camel, a beast of burden that kneels down and takes on the weight of traditional values and duties. This is the stage of obedience and conformity. Second, the spirit becomes a lion, a fierce and rebellious creature that says no to all imposed values. The lion fights for freedom, but it does not yet know how to create. It can only destroy. This is the stage of nihilistic revolt. Third, and finally, the spirit becomes a child, innocent, playful, creative. The child creates new values not out of resentment or rebellion, but out of pure affirmation and joy. The child says yes to life and to creation. This is the stage of the Übermensch, the stage of new beginnings. This metaphor captures the trajectory that Nietzsche hoped humanity could follow. From the burden of the old religious values, to the destructive rebellion against those values, to the creative affirmation of new, life-affirming values. But Nietzsche knew that very few people would make this journey. He knew that most would remain camels, obedient to the herd. And he knew that some would become lions, rebels and destroyers, but never move beyond destruction to creation. And so, the Übermensch is not a prediction of what humanity will inevitably become. It is a possibility, a challenge, a goal. Nietzsche is saying, this is what you could be if you were brave enough, if you were strong enough, if you were willing to take the terrifying step of creating your own meaning in a meaningless universe. But alongside the concept of the Übermensch, Nietzsche introduced another idea, one that is even more difficult and even more profound. He called it the eternal return, or the eternal recurrence. And it is, in many ways, the ultimate test of life affirmation. The idea of the eternal return appears in several of Nietzsche's works, but it is presented most vividly in The Gay Science and in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Here is how Nietzsche describes it. Imagine that a demon came to you and told you that your life, exactly as you have lived it, will be repeated infinitely. Every moment, every joy, every sorrow, every triumph, every humiliation, All of it will happen again and again in exactly the same way, forever. How would you react to this revelation? Would you be filled with despair, with horror at the thought of reliving all your mistakes and sufferings for eternity? Or would you be filled with joy, with gratitude, with a sense that your life, even with all its pain, is so precious that you would gladly live it over and over? Nietzsche suggests that the eternal return is the ultimate test of whether you truly affirm life. If you can say yes to the eternal return, if you can embrace the idea that your life will repeat forever, then you have achieved the highest form of life affirmation. You have overcome nihilism completely. You do not need a God to justify your existence or an afterlife to give it meaning. Your life, exactly as it is enough. With a calm, measured tone. Now, scholars have debated for more than a century whether Nietzsche believed that the eternal return is literally true, or whether it is simply a thought experiment. Some have argued that Nietzsche, influenced by certain scientific theories of his time, believed that the universe is finite in matter and energy, but infinite in time, and therefore all possible configurations of matter must eventually repeat. Others have argued that the eternal return is not a cosmological claim, but a psychological and existential one. It is a way of asking, can you love your life so much that you would want to live it forever, exactly as it is? It is a way of forcing yourself to confront whether you are truly living in a way that affirms existence. For our purposes, it does not matter whether the eternal return is literally true. What matters is the attitude it demands. The person who can say yes to the eternal return is a person who has overcome resentment, regret, and the wish that things were different. Such a person has achieved what Nietzsche calls amor fati, the love of fate, the ability to love everything that has happened and everything that will happen, because it is all part of the totality of existence. This is an extraordinarily demanding ideal. It asks us to accept not only our joys, but our suffering, not only our successes, but our failures, not only our virtues, but our flaws. It asks us to find a way to say yes, even to the worst moments of our lives, because those moments are inseparable from who we are. And this brings us back to the Übermensch. The Übermensch is the person who can affirm the eternal return, who can create values that are so life-affirming, so deeply rooted in the celebration of existence, that he would gladly live his life over and over, forever. But Nietzsche was under no illusions about how difficult this would be. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes the last man, a type of human being that represents the opposite of the Übermensch. The last man is the person who seeks only comfort, safety, and pleasure. He has no great ambitions, no creative drive, no willingness to take risks or embrace suffering. The last man blinks and says, "We have invented happiness." He believes that the point of life is to be comfortable, to avoid conflict, to have a nice job and a nice home and nice entertainment. He has no use for greatness or heroism or struggle. He just wants to be left alone to enjoy his small pleasures. Nietzsche saw the last man as the likely future of humanity. He feared that as societies became more democratic, more egalitarian, more focused on equality and universal well-being, as if thinking aloud, they would produce a culture of mediocrity, a culture in which no one dared to be exceptional, in which everyone was content to be average, in which the highest value was simply to be comfortable and inoffensive. Pausing for a moment. This is another aspect of nihilism, in Nietzsche's view. Not the dramatic nihilism of despair or destruction, but the quiet nihilism of settling for less. The nihilism of a life that is lived on autopilot, following the scripts that society provides, never daring to ask the big questions or to create something truly one's own. With a calm, measured tone. And so, Nietzsche's vision is, in the end, a dual one. On one hand, the possibility of the Übermensch, the human being who overcomes nihilism by creating new, life-affirming values and embracing the eternal return. Slowly and clearly. On the other hand, the probability of the last man, the human being who sinks into comfortable mediocrity, never realizing that the old values have collapsed, never attempting to create new ones. Which future will prevail? Nietzsche did not know. He offered no guarantees, no prophecies of inevitable progress. Pausing for a moment, he simply laid out the possibilities and challenged his readers to choose. Will you be a creator, or will you be a consumer? Will you affirm life, or will you settle for comfort? Will you dare to become an Übermensch, with a soft whisper? Or will you be content to be a last man? As if thinking aloud. These are not easy questions. They are not comfortable questions. And that, in a way, is the point. Nietzsche's philosophy is not meant to comfort. It is meant to challenge, to provoke, to disturb. Slowly and clearly, it is meant to wake us up from the sleep of habit and convention, and force us to confront the most fundamental questions of existence. But we are not yet finished with Nietzsche's ideas. There is one more dimension of his thought that we must explore. Pausing for a moment. His concept of the will to power, and the perspectivism that underlies his entire philosophy. These ideas will help us understand not just what Nietzsche believed, but why he believed it, and how he thought we could navigate a world without God. With a calm, measured tone, let us turn now to these final, essential pieces of the puzzle. Will to power, perspectivism, and Nietzsche's legacy. One of the most fundamental concepts in Nietzsche's philosophy, and one that runs through all his mature work, is the idea of the will to power. Pausing for a moment. This phrase has been badly misunderstood, often interpreted as a crude celebration of domination and violence. But in Nietzsche's own thought, it is far more subtle and far-reaching. Slowly and clearly, the will to power for Nietzsche is the basic drive that animates all living things. It is the drive to grow, to expand, to overcome resistance, to become more than one currently is. It is not primarily about power over others, though it can take that form. It is about power over oneself, over one's circumstances, over the challenges that life presents. Nietzsche saw the will to power as a more fundamental explanation of human behavior than the pursuit of pleasure or the avoidance of pain. He believed that, even when we suffer, even when we choose difficult paths, we are driven by the desire to test ourselves, to prove ourselves, to overcome obstacles and grow stronger. Think of an artist who struggles for years to perfect a craft, enduring poverty and obscurity, driven not by the promise of wealth or fame, but by the need to create, to express, to master the medium. Think of a mountain climber who risks life and limb to reach a summit, not for any practical benefit, but for the sheer challenge of it, the sense of accomplishment, the feeling of having pushed beyond previous limits. These are expressions of the will to power, the drive to become more, to achieve more, to realize one's potential. And Nietzsche believed that this drive is present in all human activities, from the most mundane to the most exalted. Even our pursuit of knowledge, he argued, is a form of will to power. an attempt to master the world through understanding, to impose order on chaos, to expand the scope of what we can grasp and control. But the will to power can also be twisted and deformed. It can become resentful, destructive, turned inward against oneself. Nietzsche believed that Christian morality, with its emphasis on humility and self-denial, was a perversion of the will to power. Unable to express their will to power outwardly, the weak turn it inward, developing an elaborate system of guilt and self-punishment. The ascetic priest, for example, who renounces worldly pleasures and inflicts suffering on himself, is not, in Nietzsche's view, transcending the will to power. He is simply redirecting it. He gains a sense of power and superiority from his ability to control his own desires, to master his own body, to endure what others cannot endure. His self-denial is, paradoxically, an expression of will to power. This idea has profound implications. It suggests that there is no escaping the will to power, no way to stand outside it and adopt a purely disinterested or selfless perspective. Even our most altruistic actions, even our most self-sacrificing choices, are driven at some level by the desire for growth, for meaning, for a sense of our own strength and efficacy. But if the will to power is the fundamental drive in all living things, then what about truth? What about knowledge? Can we trust our own beliefs and perceptions, or are they merely expressions of our will to power? Interpretations that serve our own needs and interests? This question leads us to one of Nietzsche's most radical and most challenging ideas: perspectivism. Perspectivism is the view that all knowledge, all perception, all interpretation is necessarily from a particular perspective. There is no view from nowhere, no objective, God's eye view of reality. There are only perspectives, each shaped by the needs, interests, and limitations of the being who holds it. Nietzsche sometimes expressed this idea in stark, provocative terms. There are no facts, only interpretations, he wrote. This does not mean that Nietzsche believed in complete relativism, that he thought any interpretation is as good as any other, but it does mean that he rejected the traditional philosophical quest for absolute, objective truth. For Nietzsche, the question is not, is this belief true in some absolute sense, but rather, what perspective does this belief express? What form of life does it serve? Does it enhance life, or does it diminish it? A belief that strengthens, that enables growth and creativity, that affirms life. Such a belief has value, even if it cannot be proven in some final, objective way. This perspectivism is connected to Nietzsche's critique of traditional philosophy and science. He believed that philosophers and scientists had long claimed to be pursuing pure, disinterested truth, but that in reality they were expressing their own values, their own will to power, through their theories and systems. Plato, for example, taught that the physical world is an illusion and that true reality consists of eternal, unchanging forms. Nietzsche saw this as an expression of a particular psychological need, the need to escape from the chaos and flux of life, to find stability and permanence. It was not a discovery of objective truth, but a creative act, an interpretation that served Plato's own existential needs. Similarly, Christian theology taught that this world is fallen and corrupt, and that true goodness and happiness can only be found in the next world. Nietzsche saw this as an expression of resentment, a way for the weak to cope with their suffering by devaluing the very things they cannot have in this life. Even modern science, which claims to be objective and value-free, is, in Nietzsche's view, shaped by certain values and perspectives. The scientific method values predictability, control, quantification. It seeks to reduce the complexity of the world to simple, universal laws. And this, Nietzsche argued, reflects a particular kind of will to power, the desire to master nature, to make it intelligible and controllable. Now, this does not mean that Nietzsche rejected science or thought it was worthless. He admired the honesty and rigor of scientific inquiry, but he insisted that we should not be naive about it. Science is not a mirror of reality. It is a tool, an interpretation, a way of organizing our experience for particular purposes, with a calm, measured tone. And this brings us to a crucial question. If there is no absolute truth, if all knowledge is perspectival, if everything is interpretation, slowly and clearly, then how can Nietzsche himself make claims about nihilism, about the death of God, about the Übermensch? Isn't he just offering his own perspective, no more valid than anyone else's? This is a challenge that Nietzsche was well aware of, and his response, characteristically, was not to retreat into relativism, but to embrace the challenge. Yes, he would say, this is my perspective, these are my interpretations, and I stand by them because they are life-affirming, because they enhance rather than diminish existence, because they enable growth and creativity rather than stagnation and decay. With a soft whisper, Nietzsche is not claiming to have found the final, absolute truth. He is offering a way of thinking, a set of tools, a diagnosis of the present moment, and a vision of what might be possible in the future. As if thinking aloud, he is saying, this is how I see the world, this is what I value, and if you find value in my perspective, if it helps you to live more fully and more honestly, then take it and use it. Slowly and clearly. This is why Nietzsche's writing is so personal, so passionate, so urgent. He is not a detached academic offering neutral observations. He is a philosopher who has lived through the crisis of nihilism, who has felt the terror and the exhilaration of the death of God, and who is trying to find a way forward. His books are not textbooks. They are challenges, provocations, invitations to think and feel differently. And this brings us, at last, to the question of Nietzsche's legacy. What has happened to his ideas in the more than a century since his death? With a calm, measured tone, how have they been received, interpreted, and misinterpreted? As we mentioned earlier, Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth did enormous damage to his reputation by editing and distorting his unpublished writings to fit her own nationalist and anti-Semitic agenda. Slowly and clearly. In the early 20th century, Nietzsche was often read as a prophet of German superiority and militarism. The Nazis claimed him as one of their intellectual forebears, even though Nietzsche himself had despised nationalism and anti-Semitism. With a soft whisper, it took decades of scholarly work to recover the real Nietzsche, to separate his actual ideas from the distortions. After World War II, as the horrors of Nazism became fully known, Nietzsche's reputation suffered. He was seen by some as a dangerous thinker, a philosopher whose ideas led inevitably to fascism and violence. But over time, a more nuanced understanding emerged. Scholars like Walter Kaufmann in the United States, and later, thinkers in the European existentialist and postmodernist traditions, showed that Nietzsche's philosophy was far more complex and far more valuable than the caricatures suggested. Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus drew on Nietzsche's insights about the absurdity of existence and the need to create meaning in a meaningless world. Sartre famously declared that existence precedes essence, meaning that we are not born with a predetermined purpose or nature, but must create ourselves through our choices. This is deeply Nietzschean. Camus, in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus, grappled with the question of whether life is worth living in a universe without God or ultimate meaning. He concluded that we must imagine Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, as happy, because even in the face of absurdity, we can find dignity and meaning in the struggle itself. This, too, echoes Nietzsche's call to a firm life, even in the face of suffering and meaninglessness. Postmodernist thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida engaged deeply with Nietzsche's perspectivism and his critique of truth and objectivity. They explored how language, power, and social structures shape what we take to be true or real, and they questioned the grand narratives and universal claims of Western philosophy and science. Foucault, for example, studied how concepts like madness, criminality, and sexuality are not timeless, objective categories, but are constructed differently in different historical periods, reflecting the power relations and values of those periods. This is a deeply Nietzschean approach, understanding ideas and values not as eternal truths, but as expressions of particular forms of life and particular configurations of power. In psychology, Nietzsche's insights into the unconscious motivations behind our beliefs and behaviors anticipated much of what Sigmund Freud would later develop. Nietzsche recognized that we are often driven by forces we do not fully understand, that our conscious beliefs are often rationalizations for deeper, unconscious drives. The will to power, the resentment that shapes slave morality, the ascetic ideal, all of these are examples of hidden psychological dynamics. In cultural criticism, Nietzsche's diagnosis of nihilism and decadence has remained remarkably relevant. Slowly and clearly, many 20th and 21st century thinkers have drawn on Nietzsche to analyze modern consumer culture, the rise of relativism, the decline of traditional values, and the search for new sources of meaning in a disenchanted world. But Nietzsche's legacy is not limited to academic philosophy and cultural theory. His ideas have seeped into popular culture, sometimes in surprising ways. The concept of the Übermensch has influenced everything from comic book superheroes to self-help literature. The phrase, "God is dead," has become a cultural touchstone, a shorthand for the crisis of meaning in the modern world. Of course, not all of these appropriations are faithful to Nietzsche's actual thought. Many are simplifications or distortions, but the fact that Nietzsche's ideas continue to resonate, continue to be argued over and reimagined, is a testament to their power and their depth. So what, in the end, should we take from Nietzsche? What can his philosophy offer us today, more than a century after his death? Perhaps the most important lesson is this: that the quest for meaning is not something that can be outsourced to religion, to tradition, to authority, or to society. It is something that each of us must undertake for ourselves. Nietzsche challenges us to examine our own values, to ask where they come from, and whether they truly serve life. He challenges us to be honest about the realities of existence, about suffering, about death, about the absence of cosmic justice or ultimate purpose. And he challenges us to say yes to life anyway, not because it is easy or comfortable, but because it is ours. He teaches us that nihilism is not the final word, that the death of God, the collapse of old certainties, can be the beginning of something new, that we have the capacity to create values, to give shape and meaning to our own lives, to become more than we are. Whether we accept Nietzsche's specific solutions, the Übermensch, the eternal return, the revaluation of values, is in a sense secondary. What matters is that we engage with the questions he raises, that we do not hide from the crisis of meaning, but confront it directly, that we do not settle for comfortable illusions, but seek a way to live honestly and fully. Nietzsche's philosophy is not for everyone. It is demanding, unsettling, sometimes harsh. It offers no easy consolations, no promises of happiness or redemption. But for those who are willing to grapple with it, who are willing to think deeply about the most fundamental questions of existence, it offers something rare and precious. It offers the possibility of transformation, and perhaps that is the ultimate legacy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Not a set of doctrines to be believed, but a challenge to think differently, to live differently, to become, in some small way, creators of our own values and our own meanings in a world that offers no guarantees. The philosopher who declared that God is dead did not leave us in despair. He left us with a question and an invitation. The question is, can you affirm life with all its suffering and uncertainty? The invitation is, become who you are. And with that thought, our journey through Nietzsche's philosophy comes to a close. We have walked with him through the landscape before nihilism, through the crisis of the death of God, through his visions of the Übermensch and the eternal return, and through his insights into will to power and perspectivism. We have seen a man who thought deeply, who suffered greatly, and who left behind ideas that continue to challenge and inspire. Ideas about meaning and meaninglessness, about strength and weakness, about creation and destruction. Ideas that remind us that philosophy is not just an academic exercise, but a way of living, a way of confronting the most profound questions of human existence. And now, as the hour grows late and our exploration draws to an end, it is time to rest, to let these thoughts settle like snow falling quietly in the darkness, to allow the mind to wander where it will, or to drift into the gentle embrace of sleep. For now, the questions remain, and that is as it should be. Good night.